In tonight's news edition, His Majesty the King holds more talks with U.S. officials and congressional leaders on U.S.-led Middle East efforts and Syria. The Syrian opposition submits a plan for post-war Syria that sets a vision for an interim government and foresees the expulsion of all foreign fighters. And a PLO official says the Palestinians may resort to the United Nations to stand up to Israel's settlement expansion. Good evening and welcome to the news at 10. On a working visit to Washington, His Majesty the King and U.S. Vice President Joe Biden discussed developments in the Middle East, top of which is U.S.-led efforts to bring about peace between the Palestinians and Israel. Other regional developments, namely Syria, as well as the strategic Jordanian-U.S. ties, also figured high on the discussion. The meeting, attended by His Royal Highness Crown Prince Hussein, was part of the King's encounter in the U.S. Capitol, including a series of meetings with congressional leaders and committees. We get more in this report.
On the second day of his working trip to Washington, His Majesty was meeting U.S. congressional figures and committee members. The key areas of discussion were developments in the Middle East, U.S.-Jordanian ties, and ways and means to bolster cooperation in various domains. The King had separate meetings with Chairperson of the U.S. House Committee and Appropriations Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations, Kay Granger, and the committee members, as well as Democratic leader of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi. His Majesty stressed the key role of the House could play in supporting efforts to bring about peace in the Middle East, according to the two-state solution. The King discussed developments of the Syrian crisis and its fallout on neighboring countries, to which a growing number of refugees have fled, among them Jordan, which he said is shouldering a huge burden that outpaced its limited resources.
We always appreciate the opportunity to sit down with His Majesty. There are very few people that have the quality of insights that he does into the region, and it's an enormously important strategic relationship. We discussed the refugee challenge at great length. The United States wants to do all it can to help, and we're greatly appreciative of the extraordinary lengths that Jordan has gone to welcome Syrian refugees, to provide those that are at grave risk of losing their lives some place where they can find safety and security. But of course it's putting enormous pressure on the Jordanian economy. We're also very grateful that the Jordanian people have been so welcoming to Iraqi refugees in the past and again in the present, as well as Syrian refugees. So we are looking for ways that we can contribute further to try to help.
The encounters touched on ways of support the House and its leaders and committees can provide to Jordan to help it address the economic challenges, especially those pertaining to energy, development, and the Syrian refugee crisis. The King spoke about the progress made so far in Jordan's reform process, which has contributed to enhancing democracy and public participation in the decision-making process. The meetings highlighted the distinguished friendship between Jordan and the U.S. and the role of the House of Representatives in bolstering ties. The King called on the international community to shoulder its responsibility and support the kingdom.
Well, there's very strong bipartisan support here in the Congress to provide very substantial economic assistance to Jordan to help with the refugee flows, and also given the pivotal role in the peace process that Jordan continues to play. So Jordan has been an island of stability in a very unstable part of the world, and we're discussing all we can do economically to try to maintain that stability.
Further, the King thanked the House leaders and committee members for throwing their weight behind the decision to raise U.S. aid to Jordan and support pro-Jordan policies within decision-making cycles in the U.S. The highlight of His Majesty's U.S. trip is a summit meeting with President Barack Obama in California on Friday, with the historic Jordanian-U.S. ties and the quest for Mideast peace top of the agenda. Farah Ajlouni for the news at 10.
Senate President Abdulrauf Rawabde and First Deputy Speaker of the Swedish Parliament, Susanne Eberstein, discussed ways to boost cooperation between Jordan and Sweden, mainly in the parliamentary field. Rawabdi spoke about the importance of Sweden's role within the EU to support efforts to achieve a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. He also briefed the Swedish team about Jordan's reform process to enhance democracy and public participation in decision-making, and on Jordan's parliamentary life as well as duties of the Senate. Rawabdi also reviewed key challenges facing Jordan, mainly in the energy and water fields, as well as the pressure posed by a rising number of Syrian refugees on the kingdom's various sectors. Eberstein referred to the strong Jordanian-Swedish ties and stressed the need to maintain bilateral coordination on regional developments. She also hailed Jordan's achievements along the reform path and the kingdom's efforts to bring about peace in the region. The Syrian opposition called for a transitional governing body to oversee a ceasefire across Syria and expel foreign fighters. In a confidential paper presented on the third day of peace talks with Syrian government officials in Geneva, the opposition lays out a vision of post-conflict Syria with all ethnic groups participating in a transition process. It deliberately does not refer to Assad, in line with a text agreed by world powers in June 2012, which calls for a transitional body with full executive authority. The memo was presented to mediator Lakhdar Ibrahimi and a Syrian government delegation at a joint session. The envoy will meet tomorrow with senior U.S. and Russian officials to bolster support for his bid to keep the talks on track. The paper said the transitional authority will be the only legitimate body that represents the sovereignty and independence of the Syrian state and is the only one that represents the Syrian state internationally. The Syrian government delegation has insisted the negotiations focus first on fighting terrorism. It rejected parallel track talks on the opposition's priority of a transitional government.
The proposal is that the TGB, the transitional governing body, that will be formed through mutual consent of the two parties, will have the responsibility of, forcing out or asking out, whatever it takes, every foreign fighters from the country. We don't want neither those who are supporting the opposition or supporting the regime. And currently there are many of them coming from all parts of the world. So that was our proposal.
They say contradictory things. At one point they say those are not terrorists, and yesterday they refused to acknowledge the presence of any terrorism in Syria, and now you're telling me that they're saying they're fighting other terrorists. I think we would be ready to join forces with people who take a real stand against terrorism.
The meetings continued in Geneva, but still there's no sign the suffering of Syrian civilians is easing. The official said an official said a humanitarian ceasefire allowing the delivery of aid and evacuation of civilians from the city of Homs could be extended further if there are more people wishing to leave the besieged old city of Homs. Wednesday is the last day of a 3-day extension of the truce. At the United Nations, Russia said it would veto a resolution on humanitarian aid access in Syria in its current form. Moscow denounced the draft as an effort to lay a foundation for military strikes against the Syrian government. Further worsening the plight of civilians, Syrian forces and fighters from Hezbollah stepped up attacks on the strategic town of Yabrud on the border with Lebanon. The Syrian forces were preparing for a new offensive to flush out rebels from the area. In neighboring Lebanon, security forces dismantled 2 car bombs, one in Beirut and another in the eastern village of Arsal near the Syrian border. The discovery of the vehicles came just hours after the army arrested a senior al-Qaeda-linked militant, Naim Abbas. Abbas was described by security sources as a mastermind of car bombs that targeted Shiite areas of the country. One of the vehicles was found loaded with 100 kilograms of explosives in the Corniche al-Mazra'a district of central Beirut. Abbas was snatched from his house in a Beirut suburb in a special operation led by the Lebanese army early this morning. A security source said it was Abbas who confessed and gave the location of the 2 cars. Security sources also said his arrest could help uncover radical jihad cells in Lebanon. Israel has denied entry permits to some 50 Palestinian medical patients from the Gaza Strip. The reason was because the word State of Palestine appeared on the letterhead of their application. An Israeli military spokesman said 10 Palestinians whose cases were urgent were allowed to enter Israel, while about 50 others were not. Israeli treatment for patients from the Gaza Strip is arranged by the Palestinian Authority, which exercises limited self-rule in the occupied West Bank. In the occupied West Bank, the PLO official in charge of Jerusalem affairs, Ahmed Qureh, said the Palestinians would resort to the United Nations to stand up to Israel's settlement expansion plans and actions to Judaize Arab East Jerusalem. The leftist anti-settlement Israeli group Peace Now said the Jerusalem municipality had approved a plan to build a Jewish seminary in an Arab neighborhood adjacent to the walled old city of Jerusalem. British Prime Minister David Cameron came under pressure to spell out where he would find the money for his pledge to help those affected by severe flooding in England. Parts of southwest England and swaths of land in the Thames Valley have been underwater for weeks after the country's wettest January in nearly 250 years. More densely populated areas near London were also hit by flooding in the last few days as the rainy weather continued into February. Residents are angry that what they say was a slow government response to the crisis and a lack of funding for flood prevention measures. Cameron had said money was no object in the relief efforts, but his critics said his pledge is at odds with the austerity policy of his government, which has made deep spending cuts in the last few years to tackle a record peacetime budget deficit. 3 adrenaline junkies who call themselves the Skyliners almost made their dream come true. Filmmaker Seb Montaz Roset and 2 friends went to Spain to attempt a high-lining feat between 2 hot air balloons without safety harnesses. The friends, who are all experienced skyliners and parachutists, strung a rope between the 2 baskets and attempted to cross the gap thousands of feet in the air. None of the 3 succeeded in slacklining the whole distance, and one by one the men fell to the ground, deploying parachutes to break their fall. Ola Vigen-Hattestad of Norway won his first Olympic title in a chaotic cross-country men's sprint at the Sochi Winter Games. Theodor Peterson of Sweden took silver, and another Swede, Emil Johnson, came through to take the bronze after a tricky right-hand bend on a descent sent 3 skiers tumbling. In the women's cross-country sprint, Norway also enjoyed success as Maiken Caspersen FALLA snatched her maiden Winter Olympic title after compatriot, defending champion and favorite Marit Bjorgen crashed out in the semi-finals. Away from Sochi and the NBA, LeBron James scored 37 points to lead the Miami Heat to a 103-97 road win over the Phoenix Suns. James also grabbed 9 rebounds and had 5 assists, while Chris Bosh added 21 points and 8 rebounds for the Heat, who have won 7 of their last 9 games. Dwayne Wade sat out the game due to a migraine headache. Gerald Green scored 26 points, and Gordon Dragic tallied 15 points, 9 assists, and 4 steals for the Suns, who have dropped 3 of their last 4 matches.
This is the largest lead tonight for Miami. There's the 3rd steal of the game for LeBron. Look out below.
And finally, cold tonight in most parts of the country with southeasterly moderate winds. Frost formation is expected after midnight and in the early morning hours, especially in the Badia and southern regions. Tomorrow, a slight rise in temperature, therefore it'll be fair in most areas and warm in the Jordan Valley. Winds will be southeasterly moderate, turning brisk and blowing dust in the desert regions. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect a cool night and warm day tomorrow with southerly, dusty winds and choppy seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. To end the news, here's a reminder of our top stories. His Majesty the King holds more talks with U.S. officials and congressional leaders on U.S.-led Middle East efforts and Syria. The Syrian opposition submits a plan for post-war Syria that sets a vision for an interim government and foresees the expulsion of all foreign fighters. And a PLO official says the Palestinians may resort to the United Nations to stand up to Israel's settlement expansion. With that, we come to the end of tonight's news. I'm Nancy Khair. Thank you for watching and have a good night.